May 2nd, 1945, a rail siding near Dachau, Bavaria. The boxcar sat motionless under a sky choked with ash and smoke from distant fires. No markings on the weathered wood. No guards standing watch. Just silence pressing against those wooden walls like something with weight, with presence, with terrible patience. When Corporal James Whitmore finally pried open that rusted door 9 days later, the smell hit him first urine, sweat, human decay, condensed in darkness. Then he saw them. 43 children pressed together against the back wall, barely breathing, the youngest only 3 years old. None of them made a sound. None of them cried. They just stared with eyes that had stopped expecting rescue, stopped expecting anything at all. Before we go further into this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement keeps these stories alive for the next generation who must never forget. What those soldiers found inside that boxcar would reshape everything they thought they understood about the enemy they'd been fighting for 3 years. These weren't soldiers. These weren't combatants. These were children who'd learned that silence was survival, that hope was dangerous, that adults disappeared without warning. And when that door opened and sunlight flooded the darkness for the first time in 9 days, those children didn't run toward freedom. They simply stared, waiting to discover what fresh cruelty this interruption might bring. The 45th Infantry Division rolled through southern Bavaria in early May, like an avalanche, consuming everything in its path. By the time Whitmore's unit reached the rail yards outside Dachau, German resistance had fractured into confusion and chaos. Soldiers surrendered in groups, hands raised, eyes hollow. Civilians fled in every direction, carts piled with possessions, children clinging to mothers' skirts. Entire towns stood abandoned mid-evacuation, doors hanging open, meals left cold on tables. The American advance moved faster than orders could be executed, faster than the collapse itself, faster than anyone could fully process what was happening to the 1,000-year Reich that was supposed to last forever. The division had liberated Dachau just days earlier, on April 29th. The soldiers had seen the bodies stacked like cordwood outside the crematoriums. They'd walked through barracks where skeletal figures stared at them with eyes too large for their sunken faces. They'd found the Death Train 39 boxcars filled with corpses in various stages of decomposition, prisoners who died in transport from Buchenwald, packed so tightly that the dead remained standing because there was no room to fall. The smell of that discovery clung to their uniforms, saturated the fabric, invaded their nostrils with a permanence they knew would never completely wash away. Corporal Whitmore was 22 years old, from a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa. He'd enlisted in 1943 with ideals about stopping tyranny and defending freedom. The past 3 weeks had aged him decades. He'd seen enough horror to fill a lifetime of nightmares, the mass graves, the gas chambers, the walking skeletons who could barely speak. Now he moved through the abandoned rail yards methodically, checking each boxcar, because orders were orders, because someone had to document what was left behind, because not looking meant letting the darkness win. Most of the cars stood empty, doors hanging open like broken jaws, interiors stripped or never filled. Some contained abandoned supplies, crates of documents, medical equipment, uniforms. Others held nothing but shadows and dust. Whitmore had checked 17 cars when he heard it. A faint scraping sound from inside a car near the end. The boxcar looked identical to the others. Weathered planks, rusted hinges, a heavy sliding door sealed with a metal bar. This one hadn't been opened. Whitmore pressed his ear to the wood. The sound was unmistakable, now breathing multiple sources. He called for his sergeant, and 3 men gathered, rifles ready. They expected the worst. They always did now. The war had taught them that hope was dangerous. They had seen execution sites, rooms of gold teeth, warehouses of suitcases, and children's shoes. The metal bar screamed as they pried it loose. The door surrendered, and sunlight poured into darkness untouched since May 2nd. The smell rushed out first, overwhelming. Then their eyes adjusted. Children, dozens pressed against the back wall, faces gray, eyes enormous, skin stretched tight over bone, clothes soaked with waste and sweat, lips cracked from dehydration. None cried, none spoke. They stared with blank endurance, the look of those who'd stopped expecting rescue. Sergeant Bill McKenna moved first. He climbed into the boxcar slowly, hands visible, speaking softly. "It's okay. It's over. You're safe now." None moved. He held out his canteen to the oldest boy, thin with old eyes. After a long moment, the boy reached out, shaking violently. He drank small sips, then deeper. Tears cut clean lines through filth on his face. That broke something in the Americans. Soldiers converged with water, rations, blankets. Medics arrived, triaging dehydration and disease. Most children were too weak to walk, carried out one by one like fragile glass. The youngest was Greta, 3 years old, skeletal, legs covered in sores. She clung to the older boy, Werner, fingers locked into a permanent curl. She looked at nothing. As they evacuated the children, Private Kowalski noticed words carved into the wall, 9 marks counting days. "It's a counting system," the translator said. "Beneath the marks, God has forgotten us. We are teaching the little ones to be quiet. It is the only mercy left." No one spoke. Somewhere a bird sang, obscenely normal. The children had been left behind when the staff fled, 43 of them, waiting in darkness. Klaus Brenner, a low-level administrator, had been left behind to handle final details. 56 years old, a bureaucrat who'd spent the war shuffling papers and following orders, never questioning, complicit through documentation. Now he was alone with 43 children, and no instructions, no superiors, no one to tell him what to do. He decided to load them onto a train. It wasn't mercy. It was procedure, avoid responsibility, follow habit. He herded the children into a boxcar at dawn on May 2nd. They went quietly, trained to obey without question. He locked the door, marked the manifest with numbers, not names, and walked away. The train never moved. Rail lines were bombed, locomotives destroyed. The boxcar sat forgotten on a siding while the war collapsed around it. Inside, Werner took charge because someone had to. 13 years old, responsible for 42 others. He organized them, rationed a single loaf of bread until crumbs were gone. He scratched marks into the wall to track the days, because structure mattered, because memory mattered. Even at 13, he understood witness as resistance. They had no water except condensation on metal walls. They licked moisture from wood, pressed faces to steel. By the 3rd day, the youngest stopped crying. By the 5th day, some stopped moving, lying in waste, too weak to sit. Werner knew about the camps. He thought the boxcar was the beginning of the end. What he couldn't know was they'd been forgotten, not transported, not processed, just abandoned when the system collapsed too completely to finish its cruelty. On the 9th day, when American voices called out, Werner was teaching the smallest to be still. "Quiet," he whispered. "Don't waste energy. Don't cry. Just breathe." The only mercy he knew, teaching silence as survival, stillness as strength, hope as a luxury they could no longer afford. The field hospital was set up in a school building 5 miles away. All 43 children were treated and placed in clean beds. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison worked through the night. Nothing had prepared her for children who flinched at kindness, hoarded food, woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't explain. Greta wouldn't release Werner's shirt. Morrison kept them together. The children ate slowly, some becoming ill from real food. Portions were measured. Werner fed Greta first, hid food under his blanket. "You don't have to do that," Morrison said. Werner replied simply, "You'll leave. Everyone leaves. Then there won't be more." Morrison felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening. She sat on the floor beside Werner's bed. Regulations be damned, and stayed until dawn, just so he'd know that for tonight at least someone wasn't leaving. For one night the pattern could be broken. Military intelligence began investigating within 48 hours. They traced the paper trail to the detention facility, to the abandoned administrative building where Klaus Brenner's records remained. Each child had a number, a date, a notation about parents executed, undesirable, unknown. There were no names. Those had been stripped away. The children were interviewed to reconstruct who they were, where they came from, whether anyone remained. Werner's file read, Subject 347, father executed for treason. Mother committed after mental breakdown. Subject shows defiant tendencies. His real name was Werner Hoffmann, son of a Lutheran pastor who preached against the regime in Munich. His mother had been institutionalized, not for illness, but grief. Werner was 8 when they took him, transforming a child with history into a number, scheduled for erasure. Greta's file was shorter. Subject 412, parents unknown. Orphan found in bombing ruins. No one had searched for family. She was simply processed. Captain David Goldman, a Jewish officer from New York, read the files by flashlight after dark. He'd grown up hearing stories of hidden children and pogroms. He thought he understood. But abstraction and reality were different. These weren't stories. These were children, flesh, trauma, and somehow survival. The children recovered slowly. Bodies healed faster than minds. Within weeks, most could walk. Wounds closed. Color returned. But silence remained. They clustered together, hoarded food, hid bread in pillowcases. Nights brought screaming, sheets soaked with sweat, terror that took minutes to fade. The youngest, including Greta, had little language. Speaking had once meant punishment. Morrison and the nurses began rehabilitation, teaching that crying was allowed, asking for food permitted, adults wouldn't vanish. Progress came in small moments. Laughter at a kitten, Werner asking for seconds, Greta saying a word meaning more. American soldiers adopted them informally. Off-duty personnel visited, bringing small gifts, chocolate bars, comic books, a baseball to toss in the courtyard. Sergeant McKenna taught several older boys how to play catch, patiently showing them the motion again and again until they stopped flinching at the arc of the ball through air. For many soldiers it became intensely personal. These were technically enemy children, German kids raised under the regime, fed its propaganda. But locked in that boxcar for 9 days, they'd just been children, thirsty, scared, forgotten, and that transformed everything. By June, procedures had been established for processing displaced persons and reuniting families where possible. Red Cross workers arrived to help trace relatives, document claims, navigate overwhelming bureaucracy. For most of the 43 children from the boxcar, that search ended in emptiness. Parents executed, families destroyed in bombing raids, entire towns no longer existing. The orphanages overflowed. Foster systems were overwhelmed. Europe had more orphans than it could process, more trauma than it could heal. A solution emerged slowly, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, working with military authorities, arranged for orphan children to be transported to displaced persons camps, where they could be prepared for eventual resettlement. Palestine, America, anywhere that would take them. The boxcar children were included in that first transport? Werner, now acting as the group's unofficial leader, explained to the younger ones what was happening. They were leaving Germany, going somewhere safe, somewhere no one would lock them in darkness, somewhere someone would remember their names. Greta clung to his shirt as he spoke, grip as tight as it had been in the boxcar. She was 4 years old now, according to doctor's best guess. She'd learned to speak haltingly, carefully, as if each word might be dangerous. Her first full sentence had been a question. Werner won't leave? He'd promised her then and kept promising. I won't leave you. Not ever. The convoy departed in late June. 43 children, several nurses who'd volunteered to travel with them, and a military escort. They traveled west toward France where ships waited. At the rail yard where the convoy staged, Corporal Whitmore stood beside the same boxcar where he'd found them 7 weeks earlier. Someone had already painted over it, preparing it for regular service. The scratches on the interior wall Werner's counting marks. Those desperate words were gone, covered with fresh paneling. But Whitmore would carry those marks forever. He'd made sketches of the writing before it was erased, copied the German words phonetically in his notebook, even though he couldn't read them. Years later he'd have them properly translated, frame them in his home in Iowa, show them to grandchildren. This, he'd tell them, is why we fought. The children loaded onto buses. Not boxcars. Never boxcars again. The convoy rolled out, and Werner sat beside Greta, her head on his shoulder, finally sleeping without nightmares. Through the window, Germany slipped past ruined cities, empty fields, people beginning the long process of rebuilding from ashes. He thought about the counting marks he'd scratched into wood. 9 days. 9 marks. It had felt like forever then, like an eternity of darkness. Now it was just a moment in a larger story still being written. The bus crossed into France as sun set, painting sky in shades of amber and crimson. Greta stirred, lifted her head, looked out at changing landscape. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice small but clear. Werner squeezed her hand gently. "Forward," he said. "Just forward." Records show that 39 of the 43 children survived to adulthood. 4 were lost to illness in years immediately following liberation, bodies too damaged, immune systems too compromised to fully recover. Werner Hoffman emigrated to America in 1949, became a social worker, spent his life helping other orphans find homes and futures. He never spoke publicly about the boxcar until 1985, when a documentary filmmaker found him through archived military records. Greta's full name was eventually determined to be Greta Lindemann. She grew up in a collective home in Israel, became a teacher, worked with traumatized children. She married late, had 2 sons, and never entered a train car for the rest of her life, preferring to walk regardless of distance. Corporal Whitmore returned to Iowa, bought a farm, raised 4 children. He stayed in contact with Werner for 50 years, letters crossing the Atlantic twice monthly, friendship forged in the worst moment of both their lives. When Whitmore died in 1995, Werner spoke at his funeral. "He saved more than our bodies," he said. "He saved our belief that humans could be decent." That sounds simple, but after 9 days in darkness, it's everything. His voice carried the weight of survival remembered. Sergeant McKenna, who had climbed into the boxcar first and offered water with shaking hands to a 13-year-old boy, reflected years later. He remembered expecting silence, stillness, death. Instead, he found eyes watching, children breathing, fragile life refusing to extinguish itself despite abandonment. In an interview 50 years later, McKenna explained what that moment taught him. "We opened that door expecting to find bodies," he said. "We found survivors instead. It made me realize something important, that even when systems fail completely, something human refuses to give up. He pulled out a photograph, yellowed and creased from decades, in his wallet. 43 children standing in front of a hospital building in Germany, 1945. Most of them smiling now, tentatively, as if they'd just learned how. In the front row, a small girl holding tight to the hand of a thin boy with old eyes. "I carry this everywhere," McKenna said. "Reminds me that even in the darkest moments, someone's still counting the days, still hoping for rescue, still teaching the little ones to be quiet, because that's the only mercy they know how to give. Our job, all of us, every generation, is to make sure no child ever has to learn that kind of mercy again." The photograph went back into his wallet. The interview ended, but the story remains, passed down through generations now. A reminder carved as deeply as those 9 marks scratched into wood, that humanity persists even in boxcars, even in darkness, even when everyone else has walked away. 9 days, 9 marks, 43 children, one door opening at exactly the right moment. Sometimes that's all history really is, small moments when someone chooses to look inside instead of walking past, when fear or exhaustion could have justified indifference. It is shaped by decisions made quietly, without witnesses, when no reward is promised, and the easier path is to turn away. It is the choice to believe that even enemy children deserve water, kindness, and dignity. The choice to count the days so suffering is recorded rather than erased. History survives because someone remembers, because someone refuses to let those days disappear into silence.